Welcome to Curito Connects. I'm your host, Jenn, and I've been conversing with friends around the world about life challenges and impactful moments. Conversations on this platform look at answering the questions how we overcome challenges and how our experiences shape who we are and the work we do today. I hope this work can inspire you on your own personal and individual journey. Let's dive right in. Hello, my guest today is Taiwanese American Robert Tsai, founder of Dance Prehab, a physical therapy organization that supports local dance community across all age ranges via rehabilitation, strength and conditioning, and injury risk education. Well, that was a mouthful. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Welcome to Curito Connects, and what a pleasure it is to reconnect with you since our high school days at Taipei American School, TAS. I'm pretty excited to dive into our conversation today, where Rob will basically illustrate how creating and curating spaces for healing and learning from personal experience and professionally has led him to where he is today, and why he created Dance Prehab. So without further ado, Rob, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners today and maybe kick us off by explaining how an Asian kid growing up in Taiwan, like why you pursued dance and if that was quote unquote culturally accepted as a career path for you. Because I'm just going to throw this in the conversation where back in the day, I think watching you guys dance, doing break dancing and stuff, I think the stereotypes from the parents were probably like, oh, those kids, what are they doing? They're not studying. They're listening to hip hop music. This was like, yeah, like late 90s, early 2000s, right? I mean, of course,
Yes.
how times have changed. I can tell you now, I know you're still in California and I'm in Taipei, but there are definitely lots of dance studios out here now and lots of little kids, going in and taking dance classes from hip hop to, all sorts of genres. So I'll leave you with that and you can kick us off with a little intro and share with us your journey.
All right. Yes, those young dancing boys, those heathens, what are they doing? Um, yeah, so dance for me, well, I found dance quite organically, I think. I mean, I played sports growing up, and looking back now, I played mostly baseball. But there was always a sort of acting and like theater bug that I always had. So even though I was playing sports mostly through lower school and middle school, um, I was able to be involved with some of the high school productions in those years. So for any of you who may be listening to this, in 1993 there was The King and I, and in 1994 there was Nicholas Nickleby, and so as high school productions, and so I was able to just have the opportunity to be involved there just because they need, well, The King and I, obviously you need kids, and so it was one of those things where like we just need 60 kids, and you're like, all right, cool, let's go. um, I don't even think I told my mom that I was going to go do these things. I feel like I just came home and was like, "Hey, I did this thing," and they were like, "Okay." So it
So
actually
they
like,
didn't go
sorry.
watch the production? They didn't go watch the production?
Oh no, they did. That I remember,
Oh,
like my dad like taking video and stuff like that. So, I mean, this was like at the audition that I went to, and then and then even in middle school I was still like involved in theater, not so much dance, but that's when I found, or I should say I was exposed to breaking. And then if you want to link sort of Taiwanese break-in history into this conversation, one of the main proponents of that was the 90s pop group LA Boys, because they came back to Taiwan to do their pop group thing, and they brought back with them like breaking and like their version of like hip hop. And so a lot of the quote unquote Taiwan OGs in the hip hop scene were actually inspired by LA Boys, because they brought sort of like the break-in movement back to Taiwan from the US at the time. So I was breaking, and then at some point it was, someone was like, "Hey, maybe, do you ever think about like taking a dance class or something?" And we always had it as an elective, and the person who was running our dance program at the time was Deb Fleming, who is to this day still a close friend, and her teaching methods continue to resonate with me even now with the kids that I teach. Um, yeah, so just dropped into a dance class and continued loving movement, and ultimately, I think it just became a way to merge movement and perhaps this idea of self-expression and this idea of like self-exploration in a way that probably wasn't necessarily naturally facilitated in sort of these like quote unquote Asian communities or like Asian culture, right? It's kind of like your stereotypical, oh, be a doctor, be a lawyer, but you're like, no, I must be a dancer, right? Um, but I look back on those times and I loved dance, yes, but I think also at the same time I realized that dance and theater and the arts were kind of like my method of rebellion. It was my way out, because from as long as I can remember, all the way up until like from lower school all the way up until definitely my freshman and my sophomore year, it's like I always had, my parents always wanted the best for us, and so we had tutors. We go to like Gongwen Sushi, so like Kumon, we go to, I had like Chinese tutor, I had like violin tutor, and I did like weekend SAT prep with like other really smart kids in my class. And so I was always like, man, I can't do this. But and so it's one of those things where if I played sports, I was very easily replaced, because if you have an injury or something, or you can't play, they'll just be like, oh, okay, someone just go take your position. Cool. So that happened a couple times where I didn't do so well on tests or like grades, and so then my dad or my mom would be like, all right, you're not going to your game tonight because you can't play because you got bad grades. And I was like, oh no, sad. And then but here's the thing, I realized that if I could do well in theater and dance and they gave me a main role, then it would be much harder for them to do that. So I think subconsciously it was like, oh, because now I have to do all these rehearsals and we have to do the show. So I can't do all my tutoring stuff anymore. I have to stay at school till like 7 o'clock, and I have a main role. They can't take me out of it, or they could, but it'd be a lot of trouble for a lot of other people, and they don't want to do that. So I think in my subconscious brain, that was my act of rebellion, to be like, well, this is like something I can do to not do these things that I don't want to do. But I feel like on the other hand, and I look back on it now too, that this was something that I did truly want to do, and I didn't realize it at the time how much time I was actually putting into this, right? I think we look back and we think about academics, you're like, well, I wasn't really, I think I grew up believing that I was not like a good learner. I wasn't an academic person at all. But I also think that it wasn't necessarily that. It was just that I was putting my energy into something completely different that was outside the realm of something that could be quantified, you know. So that's where like all my effort was going. And this is all stuff that I like continued on into college that I didn't realize until later. But so that's how I found dance.
That's
And
amazing. I
yeah.
just, I'm like, I mean, I always say this because I never do the video recording, so people can't see like our interaction, but it's just like
Yes.
big smile on my face. Um, I was also in King and I, so I'm actually gonna pull out a photo later after we finish
Oh
to
my
show you.
goodness.
Probably are in that same photo somewhere as the little kids sitting in the front row. Um, but so I guess I remember those days of the production where the Corellis, who were the ones doing our theaters, and
Mhm.
I don't even know if they still do that kind of stuff where they have lower school kids participate, but that was super fun and such great exposure, like you pointed out. And I loved how you explained how you, without knowing, but subconsciously, you really carved your way in terms of being like, well, I'm just going to be the lead role, and my parents can't tell me I can't do the lead role because I have to study. And I think, and I think that point you just said, like, I think it really resonates with a lot of people. So I was a 3-season athlete as well. I also had to quit one season because I didn't get the SAT scores.
Oh, I'm
Right.
sorry.
So, but I
Forever
did not have
trauma.
any trauma. Yeah. So So yeah, I loved how you kind of figured it out without really knowing that you were doing that, and in a very clever way.
I
So
mean,
I
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was gonna ask you. So it sounded like you managed to contain that kind of like fight, I guess. Like at home, if like your parents are like, "No, Rob, you need to study. Like, no more this and that. Like, what are you doing?" But instead, it was kind of like, "Yeah, well, Rob is an important part of this like production. We can't pull him out because then it won't be a production. There is no replacement, so to speak." And then also you have a younger brother, right? Which actually he also followed your path in a way. So would you say that it kind of helped him too? Like, as in your parents saw what you did, and then so it's kind of like, all right, your younger brother Tom, okay, he can also be in lead roles, and you know, versus like, oh my gosh, both my sons are dancing. They're not going to become doctors and lawyers and
Yeah, my mom used to tell me these stories about how like they weren't ever really sure what to talk about when my dad's colleagues would like ask about like his sons,
ah.
because everyone's always like,哦，医生生两个儿子，怎么突然间两个都是舞者？Right? So, a doctor has two sons. How are both of them dancers? Like, that's so strange. Like, what went wrong?
Mm,
It was always that kind of like attitude, I think, from what my parents tell me.
yeah.
So, and I don't fault them at all. It's just kind of what our culture was. But I think most people remember like, oh, Tom's a little brother, so he was inspired by Rob to do X, Y, and Z, to dance, to break, which you know perhaps perhaps that did play a role. But if you want to talk about this idea of being able to like fully express yourself and looking for different venues for that, I always think Tom had that in him. And it came out like, of course this is always looking back, but it came out in like different ways. So I remember Tom, when he was younger, he would fill all of these notebooks with like drawings of like all sorts of stuff, and um, or he would create like characters, or he would all of his drawings had a certain like narrative or a story to him, or we would like watch a cartoon and he would like adapt it to his own version of it. So um it's kind of funny because I feel like there was a point in time where I feel like when we were older, like after college, where my parents kind of they very succinctly kind of like you know 承认 like his artist self for him to him, and I don't feel like they ever did that to me. So there is no resentment, but I also think that like my parents probably saw that early on, where my brother definitely had artistic inclinations more than myself. And I
Mm.
do see that too now. I think even as people, or even as dancers, uh I was always the person that seemed, or in my view, it was like I was more interested in things like technique. So in the context of dance, it's like ballet technique versus jazz technique versus hip hop versus modern dance, what have you. And or at the time, I put a lot of pride in my ability to like, I can dance all of these things very separately. Um, Now, what Tom did is he basically was like, I understand all these things separately, but I'm going to go and create essentially my own aesthetic. And so his success as an artist really comes from his ability to draw from these different places and then really like do his own thing. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And I think, and then a lot of that probably came from for the both of us, because I think we always have this thought of like wanting to do our own thing. It's like this obsession with this idea with originality, because we were inspired by this period of break-in where a lot of these dancers were trying to be as creative as they could. And it wasn't necessarily about technique, it wasn't necessarily about like looking like another person. It was like, is this idea my idea? Is this an
Mm.
original thought? And of course we look back, we're like, well, nothing's original, everything's just sort of like recycled in different ways. And so yeah, so this idea of like originality, I think for the both of us still continues to kind of manifest in different ways. And then
Yeah.
obviously for him, it's different for me. But, you
Yeah.
know, my wife is always telling me now, she's always like, you gotta be, you always feel like this need to be like different. And I'm like, yeah, I do. you know, so I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily call it trauma, but it's definitely this thought process that has been influenced like over time that has changed forms at different points in our life. But that seems to be sort of like very consistent. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, actually, let's pull from what your wife comments on. So what I was gonna say was I loved how you integrated Tom's storyline, and your parents, like how they had to deal with their external social circle and like being like, everyone probably talking about their kids doing this and that, and they're like, oh yeah, both our sons are dancers at the time, but obviously, again, it just kind of shifts as well as time
Hmm.
goes on. And to your point, I do remember it's like Tom was in school. Tom was always the little brother, right,
Yeah.
following you guys.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure if I ever talk to him on Curito Connects, he'll probably, maybe that's something he'll talk about as well, right? Being viewed as the younger brother, but actually he really did have a lot of like you said, the creative originality side of it as well, which was much later on.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And I feel like after, and this is, probably just from my perspective, I hope you get to talk to Tom. That'd be great. But I feel like after I left for college, because we're 2 years apart. So I was 03 out of TS, he was 05. So after I left, I feel like he really sort of was able to flourish on his own. And,
Yeah, not shadowed behind the
yeah,
older
and just
brother.
not be like, oh, that's Tom's little brother or that's Rob's little brother. And it's like, no, man, it's just Tom. But I
Yeah.
mean, I would say, and I probably can't comment on this like friend group or anything like that. I'll leave that to him if you will. But it's like I look at him and he was definitely very much his own person. He's the person that will like go with his friends to watch a movie and then all his friends will decide to watch one movie and he's like, nah, I don't want to watch that and go watch another movie on his own. True story. So he is very much his own person. Yeah, and very, very himself. So,
So, were
in that
either of your
respect.
parents or like other family members like artists, so to speak? And where do you think your wife's comment to you about like, oh, you always have to be original? Like, where do you think that stems from? Like, can you remember from a young age how, like you identified yourself and why you felt like you needed to be original? And actually, I think that's really interesting because I wanted to ask if you feel like you always felt quite grounded in yourself because, I think individuals who are very much about being like original to and truthful to themselves are quite because they won't care about what other people say or what people think.
Um, I think as a kid, I cared a lot about what people think, and I think and I think we were just kind of brought up that way, like this idea of, especially growing up in a, by all things considered, my parents were very like liberal. I mean, they sent us to TAS.
Yep.
They exposed us to different cultures, things like
Yep.
that. Um, but I look back now and I can see how I probably wasn't, but I was trying to look for that, and I
Mm,
think dance was the way to do that.
mm,
I think growing up, I always understood that our family was afforded certain privileges, both like, societally, financially, all these things. And I think finding dance and exploring dance was like, oh, okay, this is something that I have to put time into to create. It's like no amount of, and this is kind of like my thought process as a kid. I obviously know that circumstances obviously lend themselves to opportunities, but this was something that I feel like I could call my own, and it wasn't something that I had like, there was no like tutor for, there was no instruction, there was no step by step plan. It was just kind of like free form play essentially, and I
yeah.
think that lent its that sort of like unstructured exploration. Knowing that we had grown up in a very, or exist in a very structured, regimented sort of environment or circumstance, school, Asian culture, what have you, um, that just opened up an entire sort of thought process that I um, don't think I would have had the opportunity to explore had I not been exposed to like dance. And so this idea of being like when we talk about like originality, it's like, oh yeah, like how do we learn um how do we learn this like one thing, but then kind of like put your little twist on it, like make it your like little thing. So even amongst like all my friends, like one person would learn one move and nobody else would want to learn that move because it's like, well, I don't want to do that. That's yours, or like, I don't want to do what you were doing. I want to do something else. And um, so I think from the get go, that was always a thought process that was always in my head. One. Two, I think this idea of like being able to be different was thinking about trying to stand out in a way that no one was in our community at the time. um, I knew that I wasn't going to stand out academically. That just wasn't my thing, you know um, and it really kind of forced me to be like, okay, well, if that isn't going to be my thing, then what is? And so it was just like I said, just like a lot of exploration, and I just kept going down this path of trying to find something. I don't think I can clearly articulate what that feeling was at the time, but there was something about dance and something about movement and something about this idea of like physical effort that wasn't sports that was feeling something for me,
Yeah.
selfishly, right? Um,
Not
so
at
so
all. You were feeding your
yes,
soul.
yeah. I mean, now I understand. I was like, oh yeah, because it is kind of crazy. You think about like, what is this? I go back and think about it, and I'm like, what was this thing that drove me to want to spend like 3 or 4 hours with my friends a day for like multiple days a week to like sacrifice and like hurt my body for, like, why was that worth it? And going back and thinking about that, and it's just, there was never like an outlet for that. And that's what dance, I guess at the time, that's what breaking was, and eventually leading to like dance. So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so that was kind of, once again, going back to that idea of originality and like wanting to be original and like wanting to be different, as my wife says. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
it's that need to just like, if I couldn't excel at what everybody was, in my perception, excelling at, or what everyone's idea of what excelling was, then it's like, well, I'm just going to go in a completely opposite direction and like
Mm.
just do something that people don't do, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then make something out of that. Or
Yeah.
that was the idea then.
Well,
Um,
and you did.
and then, I mean, it's going well so far, 40, 38 years into this life. But then going back to your question about like, did any of our parents like
Or
do we have
family,
any artists or family?
family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The answer is no, one, but they were very, very uh adamant about learning about art, appreciating art. Um, Actually, I would say my akong on my mom's side was also an artist in his own right. Not like an artist, but his, like, he was a watercolor painter. And so
Mm.
the same way that Tom has like these books of like his drawings, like recently going back and visiting my grandparents in their old age, it's the same thing. We keep finding these books and like art notebooks
Amazing.
filled with like watercolors of all of his travels, right?
Well, that's so
um
cool.
yeah, it's awesome. I have one sitting up there, so
That's very nice.
I have them with us. But so when other kids, over the summer, and once again, was very privileged to have this kind of like upbringing, these experience. But over summer, when kids were going to like New York and like LA and like going shopping and all this stuff, like my parents would be like, "You were going to go to South Dakota, but
Huh?
we're going to exactly, we're going to go to South Dakota, but we're going to explore like the national parks. We're going to go to these museums. We're going to learn about indigenous cultures."
Well, that's
Same.
amazing.
So yeah, so like when we went to, once again, I was very fortunate to like travel with I had cousins that grew up in the US. And so my mom's side of the family made it a point to get together every like 2 or 3 years. So my cousins and I, even though they grew up here in the US and we grew up in Taiwan, that we would be able to spend time together and grow up. But, we'd go to, if we would go to like, we'd be in California, and sure, we did Disneyland and like all those things, but we also went to Sequoia, we also went to Yosemite, like learn to appreciate nature. We go to Japan, it'd be like, we wouldn't do shopping, we go to temples, we go to museums. So like, or even in Taiwan, like we go to like classical music. I mean, I played violin growing up, so I was kind of like, okay, fine, let's just go. I guess I play violin, they play violin, like it makes sense. But I think there was this gradual cultivation of like art and culture that just became probably like very, I mean, obviously very ingrained, because now that just like became part of who I was. And so there were moments where my parents were like, "Oh yeah, that's like really interesting how you and your brother just got into art and like arts." And I look back on it, I'm like, well, think of all the things we used to do on these family trips and family reunions. It was always art museums, or like always some kind of like cultural thing, um,
Maybe
something related.
secretly,
Yeah, something
maybe
related to nature.
maybe secretly next time when you catch up with your parents, and you can, be like, oh, I just did this conversation and actually something came up. I'm thinking maybe at one point they, in their younger selves, they actually wanted to explore art too, just that, during their time and their generation, again, it
Yeah,
wasn't really encouraged or allowed.
I
But that's a
think.
whole separate conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also interesting because my grandfather on my mom's side, they were very big on having a very global view of the world. So once again, they had the opportunity to travel and to learn about like other cultures and things like that. So even my mom now, she goes to like a music class, or she was, I don't know if she's doing it now, but in the past they've done things where they'll study operas and then they'll go watch the opera, they like do analysis of like the music, they learn how to like sing. So it's all, my mom played piano too, so we like, the arts were always there. I just feel like they didn't think that it would just become like we would try to make it a profession or a career. It's like, oh, this is nice to appreciate,
Right,
just
right. It's like a hobby on the side.
exactly, don't make it your life. How are you
Yeah.
going to make money? You're going to be a starving artist,
Ah.
and you're like, yes.
So, so speaking of the how do you make money starve artist, statement, which many people probably
Oh
hear all the
gosh.
time if they walk down that path. Um, how did you then, when you went off to college, you majored in dance, yeah? Or performing? I don't know. Actually, I have no idea. But
Yeah.
I wanted to ask like that transition between, going to college, and I know you danced when you were in college as well. How did that shape, like and then how did you from there, had your quote unquote career as a dancer, performer, whatever else you were doing, and then you went back to grad school, was that right? And
Hmm.
then started dance prehab. So like, how can you like walk us down that the last decade,
My
basically,
entire
the
life,
last
yeah.
like 2 decades?
um so the Spark Notes version of this, and we could get into details. The Spark Notes version of this is after, so I was dancing in high school, and once again going back to the whole idea of like cultural appreciation, that's the way Deb Fleming would structure her classes. It was, we didn't learn
Oh,
about dance just to ha 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 dance. It was like, um, this dance is from like Indonesia, it means this. This dance is from Papua New Guinea, it means this. This is a, middle, this is like classical Indian dance, it means this. This is ballet, this is from France, right? This is modern dance, this is from like America, etc. So it really sort of kind of reinforced that like cultural understanding, which is so different, because I think people here in the US learn about ballet as like, oh my god, ballet is like the ultimate dance, and for us it was like, not ballet, ballet is like from France, that's what it is, like a more like ethnographical perspective. So from there, danced at TAS, and then when I came to California, I went to Chapman University. I was actually a dance minor, but the same way that we talked about how like I was just doing things and not realizing I was actually doing it. I was a dance minor, but I dropped in any class that I could, to the point where I probably could have been a major if I actually registered for those classes. And I, kicking myself in the head for that now. But my parents wouldn't let me major in it, so I had to do. I was a communications theory major, which is a whole nother discussion. But so I was a comm theory major, and I was a dance minor, but I was dancing more than anything. And while I was dancing at school, within the dance program, I was also breaking and continuing to connect outside of our community. Very much the same way that I did at TAS, where I was just dancing with those dance in high school, but then breaking took us out of the TAS bubble and put us into sort of like the local scene. So we got to know local dancers, went to local jams, and those relationships are still relationships I have now. Um, and so back to being in California, um, danced at Chapman, and then was still breaking outside. And then everything just kind of like, I look back now and I feel like, our lives are just a series of moments that just so happen to connect. And so much of it is chance. And so much of it is like, um, when preparation meets opportunity. And I feel like I look back and I feel like I've just like stumbled across. It's like, oh hey, look, there's this, and like, oh hey, look, there's that. So the transition between college and professional life was, most of the time dancers will try to get an agent up in LA. So that's where I was in Southern California, and LA, Los Angeles is kind of like the commercial dance central of in the US, right? If you want to dance in music videos, movies, things like that, LA is the place to be. If you want to be in entertainment, essentially. Um, I was my one of my classmates was like, "Oh, there's an audition for an agency coming up. Let's go." And I had nothing to lose. I was like, "Okay, cool, I'll go." It's like a free class, and it was like one of my first times up in LA. And I went and auditioned, um, and I got signed, and then she did it, and I felt so bad because it was like opposite. It was like one of those things where like this person had been like dancing their whole life, and this was like their dream to like get signed with an agent, and you know the story continues on, but ultimately what happened was like I didn't even think about wanting to get signed, and it just worked out, that there was something about the way that I was performing that they were like, yes, we'd love to have you as part of our agency. So it's one of those things where I was like, well, I guess the next thing is to move to LA now that I have an agent. And so I did that. But of course, it's never just like all of a sudden you're not just like booking the biggest jobs or anything like that. So while I was auditioning and taking class, I was also working at Starbucks. I was also, which I worked in college, so that was a nice transition up to LA. So I worked at Starbucks. I taught dance classes, and you do all sorts of like interesting side jobs. So still dance, but you still like perform. So I would perform at like birthday parties and bar mitzvahs, which are wild sometimes. And or sometimes it's like corporate events where it's not really like complicated dancing. You're just there to entertain. So you step touch for like 3 hours, but it pays the bills, right? You get a little bit into like some like extra work, and so there are like you sit there for 8 hours because they need a theater full of people for this one scene, or you are just a pedestrian like walking through, but that's what you do to get the bills paid. So all of that in combination with like dance gigs that we would do, or every once in a while you do a commercial, or sometimes it's like print work, so you're also kind of like modeling, so you're literally doing everything, to
Mm.
until you can sort of like get your quote unquote like big break, whatever big break means to you, right?
Oh.
um but I was fortunate that through everything, ultimately I was able to, right, have a roof over my head and put food on the table, and maybe put a little bit of money away And I mean, it wasn't like fantabulous, but you were like, I'm living the dream. I'm a dancer, in LA. Amazing.
But
Yeah.
I'm gonna backtrack a little bit, and then we can then lead up into how you transition to like like PT side of things, the physical
Mm-hmm.
therapy side of things. Because when you were just sharing with us that story earlier, I did pick up a few things when you said first, like your parents didn't allow you to
Yes.
major in dance, and I was thinking like, oh, but you could have just kind of did what you did in high school, which is kind of like toto like secretly, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like just like you said, you took all those classes, you just didn't register for it.
Yeah.
But so there was,
That
I just
was
thought, wow,
Tohoda.
yeah, I was just thinking like, wow, again, it's still in the backdrop, they're still there. Like it sounded like that's actually what you really wanted to do, and you spent all your time. That's what you spent all your time doing. That was your day in and day out. Um, so parental noise still there.
Yes.
And then when you said you got signed as an into the agency, that to me sounded like the story you said very early on about how you went to audition for The King and I, and you came back home and told your parents like, "Oh, by the way, I'm in this production." So it's almost like same thing. Like you said, "Oh, by the way, I went up to LA and I just kind of went with a friend, and they want to sign me." And I was just thinking, like, how did your parents take that? And then I loved how you explained how you hustled through those years of picking up whatever you could get, and working all these different jobs. And I mean, that's what artists and performers do. Um, were your parents worried for you?
Yes,
Again,
of
with that
course.
noise,
Yeah.
noise in the back
I
of it. And
yeah.
I guess what I wanted to get at was like, how did you? Not, I don't want to say like how did you make peace with it, but how did you navigate that relationship with them? In terms of like, I studied, I graduated, and I'm not sure like what their expectations were for you, or like what your expectations were for yourself at that time, and like kind of like what's Rob's future,
Yeah.
like
Um to be perfectly honest, I think they were probably just under low grade stress the whole time. And it's not that they didn't want it. I think there's also an aspect of like just the culture is a little different, you know. Because I was in a place where I could see it working out for other people, but then they were not with me, and they had no reference point for what that could possibly look like. And
yeah,
it's, at that point it's probably not even like an Asian thing, it's also probably like a bit of a generational thing too, right?
yes,
It's like
yes,
stay with
yep,
the same company for 30, 35 years,
yep.
get your pension, get your gold watch, and sweet, you know pension, what is that? Amazing. So I mean that even continues
Yes,
now,
yes,
because like running a
yes,
business now, and well, I know we'll get to this, but like running a business now, it's like I don't think my um parents really have a frame of reference of like what that truly looks like,
yeah,
and I'll tell them all the things that I'm doing, and it's basic to them, it basically sounds like I'm doing 10 different jobs, and they're like, it
right,
does, like,
right,
you know
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so yeah.
Do you
Yeah,
feel
so
like
it
emotionally you, and I'm just asking, obviously everyone's process is different, but I was curious to see if for you, throughout this process, were you ever trying to seek their approval for what you were doing, or like, trying to allow them to really understand your world? Or has it always been very like, they don't get it, but they're still very adaptable, and like you said earlier, they're quite forward thinking, so they're like, all right, we still don't get it, son, but okay, as long as you're healthy, and you're doing your thing, we'll let you be. I was just curious for you, like, how did you manage that relationship, or yeah, and of course, like, you're far away, so they can't see, like you said, they can't see your day to day, how you're living your life, what kind of things you're doing to really understand, I guess, right?
mhm. Yeah, I like I think you hit it. I think you hit on the spot there. My parents were, even though they may not have like understood, they still, and you know, maybe this is something I'll ask my mom. Like, yeah, what was going through your head? She'd probably just say like, I was really stressed out like for like 8 years. But yeah, they still let us. do our thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was just one of those things where they just over time began to trust like who we were, like both my brother and I, like trust like who we were, and like trust that we were just going to be able to make it, or make
Yeah.
it work for us.
Yeah.
um they, obviously supported in different ways, but ultimately I think they always had this inkling that we were adaptable, you know
Yeah.
and having to like navigate different things over life. So like obviously navigate like the difference between um, Taiwanese culture, American culture, living in Taiwan, living in America, coming to America on our own, and then or like essentially them dropping us off at college, and being able to
Right.
manage all those things. It's like, oh, statistically speaking, they're doing okay. So statistically speaking, I shouldn't have to worry too much, or at least I think that's what they were thinking at the time. Um, so yeah, and even now too, right? Like talking about the whole like running a business thing, they might not really understand what that entails, just
Yeah.
because there's a lot of social and cultural context
Yeah.
currently in like what I do that is not apparent in Taiwan. So
Right.
they they still gave us the freedom to like do those things, and I think over time they began to see like, oh, okay, this is like something that rock can actually do. So there was, and I think I don't know if your listeners will remember this, they probably will, but there were a few of us that did a silly TV show a couple of years ago. But to them, that was like the moment that we had like made it. They're like, wow, like you're on TV, and like people in like there, it was on the like the
What
entertainment shows back
which
in
TV show?
Taiwan. There were a few of us that did America's Best Dance Crew.
Oh, I
Yeah,
don't think I
this.
knew that
Oh
actually.
well, now you know. Well, that show is now
What
like
year what year was it that you
that
guys were
was
what
that
year
was
were you?
2011, so that's 12 years ago. That's
Oh,
like,
wow. I
yeah.
had no idea. So you guys were, uh, in the show.
Yes, we were on the show as a
Okay.
contestant. Yeah. But it was like, everyone is, and once again, everyone is really excited about it, but it was one of those things where my parents were like, they could see what we were doing, right? And to them it's like, oh, it's like this like really popular American like TV show, and you're on there and you're like representing Taiwan and you talk about Taiwan. Like, that's so great. You're doing it with your high school friends. Awesome. Um which is, and so that then for them became like a reference point. And I think like
Wow.
entertainment for them, like making it in entertainment is like, being a personality, like dang yiren and stuff like that. And
Mm.
so they kind of saw that path, and so there was a lot of talk about like, well, if you continue down this path, like, would you want to do that? Would you want to come back to Taiwan to do that? And I'm like, I don't know.
Oh, I
Anyway,
love
so
that.
so at that point I feel like my parents were like, oh, okay. In their minds, I think that gave them a reference point to be like, wow, okay, they're making it. They can
Yeah.
do it. Like, we don't have to worry.
We're
And so,
proud we're proud of our boys.
yes,
We know
they're
what
like,
to
oh,
tell our social circles now.
yeah, they're like, oh, and then after that, we did like another competition, which was like hip hop, like world hip hop competition. Hip hop international is what it was called, and I think we were like one of like the 美国代表队, and so then we like went to like the 全世界大比赛, and then we got like fifth place or something, like out of top 10, no, third place. And so they're like, oh, like上这个美国的电视节目，like 拿第5名，and then like 全世界like what was it,
Yeah.
like
It was against, like,
世界舞
reference
蹈
point.
大比赛，yeah, it's like third place, wow, amazing. And so for them, they were like, oh, okay, it's the same thing, where there were these measurable things that they could finally see and
Yeah.
understand for themselves, that
Tangible,
like,
yeah.
yeah, it's tangible for them. But then you look at it, to us, it was like, oh, that's a TV show. So I'm like, it's a TV show, but if I go into like a circle at like a jam or something, like, there are plenty of dancers that are better than me. They'll like smoke me any day. And then same thing with like the competition, right? It's like still very curated. So it to us it didn't necessarily feel not that it wasn't real. I mean, there was effort behind it, and there was like accomplishment and a sense of accomplishment behind that. But I think for my parents, it was bigger for them because they could finally see like what was actually happening, and like
Mhm.
that we were able to make something out of, like, when I see these things, the last thing they recall is probably like, oh, they're just these kids rolling on the ground, and then, oh,
Right.
now they're on these big stages, amazing. So I think at that point my parents were able to like make more peace with it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it was also at that point that I decided that I didn't want to perform, and I wanted to go back to physical therapy school and study like physical medicine. So,
Oh,
and
and
so
why was
then,
that?
I think
Like, what
over,
prompted sorry, I was gonna say, what prompted you to want to do that switch? That you didn't wanna be a performer anymore, that that you wanted to go down that path?
I think as well, multiple reasons, but I think the biggest reason was I actually fell in love with like teaching and educating. I always taught dance to sort of supplant income at local dance studios in Southern California. And then when we did this TV show, we were afforded opportunities to travel and perform, but also teach classes. And it was nice to be able to share our artistry with these communities. And granted, there were mostly like Asian American communities, a lot of colleges, like the Taiwanese American college groups like brought us out, right? So we could have these conversations about what it meant to be like from Taiwan and what this meant for us, like selfishly. But it was a way to connect with the community, and it was a way to sort of like move together through dance. And but more importantly, I think when I was teaching dance, I was primarily teaching um, sort of like adolescent age groups, so anywhere between junior high and high school. And to see these kids, and a lot of, I taught at more of a recreational studio, so they whose owners were also Taiwanese, and
Mm,
basically was my surrogate Taiwanese family here in the U.S. during my college years. They when I was teaching those kids, it was so incredible to watch them grow through dance and grow through movement, to see like a really quiet kid become very expressive, or have a method of expression, or a method of exploration, and to see them change over time.
yeah,
Um,
that's really powerful. It's
it
like a
is. and,
gift
and I
to
and
be
I
able to
think,
do that.
and I mean, you know, I think being able to witness that change just really made me think about, okay, there's something very powerful about like teaching movement and like being in this space and being able to guide people. Um, one, and then two, I mean, I saw myself in them, because like breaking, I feel like was may probably what kept me out of trouble, because that's where my energy went into, so I wouldn't have energy to go do like stupid things, or things that would be unproductive depending on who you're talking to. But
So, I mean, you
I
could have just became an educator, right? Like, you could have just become an instructor, or like, a teacher. But why did you then want to integrate the rehab side of it to then birth dance rehab?
mm,
Like,
it
how did that, like, yeah, how did the one plus one, like, come together?
um actually, that was my backup plan. If I didn't get into physical therapy school, I was going to become a teacher. um
Oh.
so so physical therapy school,
Did
I
you
think,
personally have a lot of did you personally have a lot of injuries yourself?
yeah, so there was that
Okay.
experience too,
Yeah.
right? But I think it was like one of those things where maybe once again subconsciously, it would I was trying to seek approval from my family, and so it's like, well, physical therapy is kind of like medicine, so I would be the physical therapy is a doctoral level education currently here in the U.S., and so I would be a quote unquote doctor, right? And then I could work in the medical system and be a medical professional, right? So there was obviously that kind of thought. Um, so I told my parents that, like, hey, I'm thinking about physical therapy school. And their first thought was, are you sure? Like,
Oh.
yeah, you're sure you can do that? Um, but this, I mean, it was there was reason behind this because in my sophomore year of high school, I straight up got an F in chemistry, and it's like not even like F figuratively, like F literally. And if you know us being from TAS, it's like a B minus is like an F. But no, there's an F on my report card. But so it's like, and once again, I was never like academically inclined, right? Or I thought I wasn't, um, because everything was like super competitive, and I wanted to do this dance thing anyway. That's where my energy was going into. Um, so that was my first thought. My parents' first thought was like, "Are you sure? Like, are you kidding me? Do you even know? Like, are you even capable of this?" Not
Do
in
you remember
a
that F?
yeah, exactly. No, that's they straight up brought it up, right? And so then I didn't they weren't doing it out of like it's not that they didn't believe that I could do it. It's just that from past experience,
Yes, of
statistically
course. Yeah.
statistically speaking, you are not good at science. And now and now you want people's lives to depend on you? Like what? So
Mm.
but this is where I feel like I guess you could say it got like the dance performance and like the energy perhaps quote unquote like out of my system because like I went back to I didn't get a I didn't do any prerequisite courses for physical therapy school in undergrad, so that's like you have to do your two semesters of physics, 2 semesters of bio, 2 semesters of chemistry,
Ooh.
all of that. So um but then I started like taking class again, and there was definitely something different, and I think my focus was shifted to where I was like, okay, if I want to be at this place, this is just something that I'm going to have to do. And um it, it I guess you could say academically I did well, like I was doing very well in school to the point where like I think I told my mom I got like 100 on like a chemistry test one time, and then while I was doing my prerequisite courses, and then my brother was with my mom back in Taiwan, and then Tom was like, "Yeah, mom just like made this sound that like I've never heard before, like a very like she's like extremely extremely delighted, like just like really happy." It's like I've never heard that sound from her before, and so like a like an exclamation,
Oh,
so, and I think at that point, I just was like, okay, I want to make this work, and I want to learn, and I want to be able to redirect my energy to it. So basically the energy that I had directed towards dance then I was able to find that within like my academic studies, at least in terms of like preparation. I mean, there's also like pressure too, because it's like if you don't get in one year, you have to wait another year to apply, and it's just like so much of
yeah.
a hassle. So I'm like, well, let's just kill it now, and then just do it once. And I was hearing from all these people that like, oh, it's like really competitive, you have to apply like 2 or 3 times, and I had a few classmates that applied 2 or 3 times to get into PT school, and for whatever reason life was like, yes, we will let you in.
This is your calling. This
This
is
is apparently, yeah. So I was very fortunate to do that, and I went through physical therapy school, did all that, and then over PT school, there was never like a sort of like dance focus, but I
Mm.
went and sought out people outside of my program to learn from, like went to conferences or like just like talk to people. So once again, it's this whole thing about like the system doesn't provide it, so you just got to go outside to find it.
Yeah.
Um, and then I have, since working in school or since graduating, I've worked in a few different um, I've worked in a few different environments. So my first job out of school was actually at Disneyland. So I worked. They have like physical therapy there, so I got to work with the performers, but I got to work with just their staff, um,
Mm.
security guards or like ticket people,
Oh,
checking people.
awesome.
So it was really nice to sort of like be behind the scenes
Yeah.
to see that and help people out. And then COVID hit, so then I had to pivot.
Mm.
So then I did home health, And home health here is basic. It's mostly like geriatric patients who are at home because they, have their issues and they can't leave. And so sometimes they need rehabilitation. They had a fall. They need to learn how to balance again. So you drive to their house, drive to the next house, drive to the next house. And so as I was doing both of those things, like on the side, I was just slowly building. I didn't really want to know what it was at the time. It was like, oh, dance, physical therapy for dancers, definitely needed. So let's do that. And so then I just started like seeing a few people. And then over time, it's just got to the point where I was like, okay, cool, this could be its own full blown thing, which is where I am
We're
now.
at today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow,
So,
I just got
and
like I got goosebumps because I just feel like everything you said in the last like 50 minutes, it's just like it really threads together, you know. I don't know if you spent time thinking about all of this because we went way back and then we kind of like brought it all the way to now. It
yeah,
really just shows like the alignment of like, and really being persistent with what you feel called to do, like what you said earlier, like dance is always that outlet for you. And then, one thing led to another. And then like how it just integrates itself, and
hmm
it's really, really beautiful. Like all this stuff you're doing with dance prehab and
yeah.
rehab and the people you're affecting and helping and how it's very much your personal journey and story and your experience that brought this together.
I think I've also had incredible mentors through my life. And I think a lot of it has to do with I had very strong, um, I had very strong individuals who I like continue to draw from now. So, you know, like Deb Fleming for sure, because she introduced dance in a way that was respectful. It wasn't just dance to dance, right? It was like understand where dance came from, and understand that these are like societies and cultures, um, to learn from. And I think being in an international school, that inherently is kind of there. We might not have thought about it consciously when we were growing up because we're just like, oh yeah, haha, this is high school, right? And then like, and then so when I think back, I think about how all of those experiences were cultivated and curated. And when we learned dance with Deb, it was like, yes, this is dance, but there are so many underlying factors about why this dance is what
Mm,
it is. These are the
yeah.
stories that dance tells. So it's never just like the surface, right? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
what there are there's symbolism behind certain gestures. There are meanings behind certain movements, and it is never like what it seems, right?
Yeah.
And then when I got to college, the my college mentor was, I have two of my college professors that I hold very dear to my heart, but one of them is this lady Robin Kish, and she's like a very very big dance health advocate. And actually, when I decided I wanted to go to PT school, or that it was just a thought, I was like, I feel like I want to go to PT school. Her office was the first place I went to. So, and this is like I'd graduated for like 7 years at this point, and we had sort of still maintained like contact. But I, drove from LA down to Orange County, which is like an hour and a half drive on a good day, just to be like, Robin, this is like physical therapy school. What is it? And so, and we still have a close relationship now. And she was always like a brilliant educator. And we talk about all these things within dance. There is a field of medicine now, like dance medicine and science, right? There is science behind dance the way that there is science behind sports, and this
Yep.
community is like slowly growing. And I just saw everything through her lens as an educator, all the things that she was trying to do as an educator, that maybe she'd run to like certain roadblocks, and we like talk about what things are. So it wasn't about always just about like, oh, dance medicine is this. Dance medicine exists, but what are the underlying things that have to happen? Why do dancers get injured? Why is there physical injury? Why is there like mental
Mm,
health issues? So the same thing, you're looking at the surface, but you also have to understand context. Like, where are these things coming from? What are the environments that these kids are learning, or like dancers are coming from, and what is their understanding of their bodies and of their craft that results in these things, right? The
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
like an ankle sprain isn't always just like an ankle sprain, or an ankle injury, I should say, or a shoulder injury. It's like, how did that injury occur? It's like, you were overworked, but did you understand that you could be overworked? Or is it just the culture that has brought us to this point of like, overworking is like,
Mm,
the show must go on. So no matter how injured you are, you must do it. Right.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
in the same way that um in the same way that Deb talked about, this is a dance form, or this is a form of dance or a dance technique, but there's a culture behind it.
Yeah.
When Robin used to talk about dance, and we still talk about this now, right? When we talk about dance injuries, or being able to heal people, there is a story and there is a culture behind that too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then when we get into like physical therapy, in PT school, my mentor there was a one of my professors, and her name is Joe Smith, also a dancer, also worked in sort of this like dance rehabilitative space for a little bit. Her research is mostly in low back pain now, and she does a lot of wonderful things there. But it was kind of like the same thing where you're like, okay, I'm in this like physical therapy world, but once again, there is context to healing, there is context to space. So a person is never just their injury. There is a story behind their injury, and there is a progression of how them as a person became to feel these certain things and then be in
Yeah.
front of me, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think well, currently, and I'll talk about this in terms of like rehab now, is um, if we think about this idea of pain and being out of pain, what is the relationship of pain to like a person, right?
Yep.
Because
Yep.
dancers will always be like, well, I have like a high threshold, but that's because culturally we've been pushed to this point where pain is sort of normalized, so
Mm-hmm.
there
Mm-hmm.
have been situations where people are like, oh, this like, someone might rate it like a 10 out of 10, and a dancer is probably like, oh, that's like 3 out of 10, it's not that bad, you know but you're also like, yeah,
Yeah.
but you can't walk. Like, yeah, that's really not that bad. You're like, oh, come on,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know
And that has a mental aspect as well that comes in, huh?
Yeah. So I would say that, if I were to tie everything together now that I look back from both like TAS and like going to college and then going into healthcare now, there's always been an aspect of what is the underlying context, and why do I behave, and why do I believe certain things that I do. Um,
Yeah.
which is so funny because let's circle back to my communications theory major, which is
Yeah.
like so much more relevant now that I'm in healthcare, because how you are able to communicate ideas and how you're able to frame ideas is so key in how somebody heals, right? Going back to your original intention about, yeah, being and curating spaces for healing, right? Because if someone comes to me, and this is sort of, none of this is medical advice, by the way. It depends on who you're talking to, but there are situations where, let's say, if someone is feeling pain, um, and there is it is very different for someone to be told about their pain to be like, well, your disc slipped out, and your vertebrae is out of place, or uh, this muscle is torn, or like, you're there's this narrative that you begin to tell them, versus if you say, well, that's okay, you need to let your body understand that it's safe to move because your body is like protecting so hard right now, and let's move in these ways that's edifying for you, and let's move in these ways so your body can develop these patterns that it knows it's safe, right?
Yeah.
Very similar situations physically, but your language and the space that you create is going to change everything, and like what the
Yeah.
perception of it is, so.
You know,
And I think, yeah, so I think over time, it's all of that we've grown up in has now sort of like manifested into sort of, I guess, what dance prehab is, or at least my approach to like healing and being able to communicate these ideas.
yeah. Well, it just has manifested into your very, very true essence of you.
Yeah, and
It's
it's,
actually,
people talk about like work-life balance and like being able to separate yourself from your work, and I think I
no,
just
but it's so much of,
lean
yeah.
I can't, yeah. I just lean into the fact that I'm never going to be able to separate that, and I think I find my peace with that. Um, my wife also find has to find peace with that. Yeah. So they're like, can we not talk about work? And I'm like, okay, fine. I just
But
won't talk
it's a
about it.
very integral part of you and what you do. And I just wanted to add the communication theory part that you brought up, which I thought the way you explained it was so nice, because it's not only in how, like the example you shared with us just now about like an injury and the way you talk about it, but just in general, right? Communication in general is like the same thing, right? How you communicate with your parents, how you communicate with your kids,
Hmm.
even like your doorman or the barista, just it's communication. It's all
Hmm. Yeah.
communication, right? And
And
so the messaging.
especially, yeah, especially now, right? If there's any comm theory nerds out there, Marshall McLuhan's theory of the medium is the message. It's like communicating through Facebook, communicating through Instagram, communicating through TikTok, which is a whole nother story. Shout out to Austin. But I think I think it's like with us operating in the space that we do, working with like younger dancers, working with the younger generation,
Yeah,
there needs to be an understanding and acknowledgement of like how they are moving through this world,
yep,
because if you can hear that in them and you can allow them to understand that like you are making an effort in trying to understand how they operate in their world, they
yeah,
will be able to allow you into theirs,
yeah,
that much more.
yeah,
So, and it's kind of strange because I never thought, we talk about wanting to work with dancers, but there's also like, well, working with professionals is different than working with pre professionals, is different than working with adolescents, is different than working with like younger kids.
mm,
So in all of those different age groups, there's sort of like different contexts um, depending on how they learn, right? So with like younger
yeah,
kids, maybe I incorporate more games. I basically trick them into doing things. With the older dancers, with the older kids, you can then be a little bit more like ethereal and talk about like more, not ethereal. You can talk more like about like feelings and like accessing certain sensations, or you can talk about the anatomy and stuff like that, but you're not going to get that with an 11-year-old. So
right.
how are
Yeah,
you
you understand.
modifying?
Mhm.
Yeah, so essentially it's kind of like code switching, right?
Yeah, yeah,
um but in the same way, to bring it back to sort of like our upbringing, it's like the way I behave with elders in Taiwan is very different from the way I would behave with like parents who I know are of like Asian or Taiwanese or like Chinese descent is very different from the way I behave with parents who are like white or just like straight American. You know,
right. Yeah,
there's different ways of interaction that communicate different things. So,
yes,
um, like I would never call, like here a lot of my friends' parents introduce themselves by their first names, like, hi, I'm Bob, hi, I'm Jim, but you would never try to do that with um like like any of our friends' parents, right? You're just like, oh, I house is Wuhao, right? You wouldn't be like, oh, call them by their first name. You just don't. So
mm,
I think with um growing up the way we did and being able to shift and adapt, it's like you understand like how people, I mean, there is a way to operate depending on like what your culture is, right?
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think currently, right now, that translates over into being able to sort of like read how somebody responds and being able to, once again, use language and create an environment that they are going to respond best to in the
yeah,
context of being able to heal,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Um, I love this conversation, and I think we can keep going. And you are so full of knowledge and experience to share, but we are coming short on time. So I usually ask. I have this like standardized, few questions I ask
Hmm.
to wrap up. So if you could, I guess give it in a short
I will
short answer
try.
form. Well, I mean, usually I go, what keeps you grounded? And I think obviously for you, it's like dancing, like that keeps you grounded ish. But maybe there's something else that you do that keeps you grounded. I don't know. I also asked like what resources you would recommend to people, if they were interested in dance as a career, if, they were interested in, yeah, PT, or kind of what helped you. I mean, you mentioned your mentors through school, but what helped you, when you were questioning things or when you were like stuck, what kept you going? Sometimes it could be books or etc. um and then the last one is, what 2 cent words of wisdom would you give to those who are listening to this episode? I'm assuming obviously community members we know, but also maybe community members from your dance rehab um, program. Yeah, or and it could be just, or what would you tell your younger self what you know now? That's kind of how I would shape it. I know this is three very mouthful questions, but I think, and I
Yes.
noticed you're, penning it down. So I,
Yes, I know. I gotta write things down. I have so many Google Docs right now because I can't remember anything.
yeah. So if
Um,
you could just, give
what?
us your
Yeah.
short answers to these, and then we can wrap up the conversation.
Yes. What keeps me grounded? There's a few different things. First and foremost, I mean, my wife keeps my feet on the ground. I think I will just go in whatever direction, and she is the one that like will reel me back. But she is also the one that will entertain all these silly thoughts. So I'm able to do what I do because she lets me do these things. But I think personally, it's what keeps me grounded is just continuing to find things to challenge myself and learn. It doesn't mean like learning something like completely new, but it's kind of like taking the same concept and running with it. So even though I don't dance very much now, um, I rock climb. But rock climbing in the same vein is sort of it's still physical, which is nice. And if I were to draw an analogy between rock climbing and, for example, like break-in, with break-in, there's like, you could say that there's a starting shape and an ending shape. But what matters is not how you start and how you end, but what matters more is how you get from point A to point B. What is your progress? What is your transition? Um, so when I think about rock climbing, it's the same way because based off of my body type and my physiological makeup and my strengths, I will climb a certain way that is different for somebody else because it got to be different, and um, and that helps me remind me of like kind of what my strengths are, which is also funny because when I climb, I can't muscle anything. I have to be a very technical climber, so it's always finding the most efficient way. How can I move with the least amount of energy expended, right? Um, so that's kind of like what keeps me grounded. It's just like constantly understanding that there are principles that I like to explore and exploring that in different ways. Um, and then honestly, it's just constantly learning because and this probably filters in a little bit too about like PT, like what helped me with PT. And if I ever had a question about something, it was just like, go find the answer. And if you couldn't find the answer, let's go find the people that had that answer. And if you couldn't find the people that didn't have that answer, then perhaps it came down to like you being the answer, right? So I feel like Dance Prehab as an organization was kind of built out of this perception of like, oh, that's great that there's like a dance PT, but there's nothing that's holistic. There's nothing that kind of really combines sort of rehabilitation and strength and conditioning and education and just being like a nice, well-rounded human. Like ultimately, that's kind of what it's become. And so that's the answer that I'm constantly asking myself: is how do I build an organization that is going to create well-rounded humans, right? Outside the context, within the context of dance, but also outside the context of dance.
Hmm.
Now that I have employees, I ask the same question of them. Like, how is somebody working for me going to be a well-rounded human? And if they are going to be a well-rounded human, then I need to treat them like a well-rounded human. So that's a challenge for me too. Like not
Right.
even just as a clinician or as a physical therapist, but now also as a business owner and a boss.
Yeah.
Right. Um, and as far as advice for a dance career, I don't know. There's so many things you can do now with like, especially with social media and all that. Um, I think it's being aware of the tools that are available to you and understanding how to utilize them. Not necessarily, not necessarily to like, oh, use them to your benefit. And it's not always about more, but can you use these tools to communicate a more authentic self? And if you do use these tools, how do you maintain authenticity
Yeah.
within these platforms?
Yeah.
So um, I've never really had a social media following, or I mean, I have a social media following, but I've never really made that the point. The point for me has always been about just put good information out there. That's all we want to do. So,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting because I feel like people have told me that they'll read my comments or like read my captions on social media, and then they'll meet me in person and then they'll be like, "Oh wow, it really is you who is like typing those captions." And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, it is me, you know?" So so I don't know, and it's like once again, I don't have a social media strategy. I think I just try to be the most honest person that I can on these platforms, and if I am consistent over time, then people will hopefully notice that,
Yeah. I
um
almost feel like for you, it's kind of like going back to your kind of theme. It's just being original. You're just being you.
I mean, I guess I don't know. And maybe right now I don't have the words for it. Maybe we'll talk in like 20 years and I'll be like, hey,
Sure.
actually, I realized that this is what I was doing. But I think, having maybe this is like a residual sort of like process after being involved in entertainment where you had to like personify certain characters, to
Mm.
be hireable or to be entertaining, or even now with like TikTok and like Instagram and all this stuff, people are drawn to personalities, right? So, but I don't have the energy to create a personality, you know and then I'm just like, this is my personality, so I guess I just kind of keep it consistent with that. You know,
Mm.
it's I think I just want people to understand that like, hey, look, we're just good people and people to be we want to give people the opportunities to do what they want and do what they feel like they need, right?
Yeah.
So in the context of healing, it's like, yeah, it's not just I don't want you to have pain, it's I want you to be out of pain so you can continue to do these things. You can go for the hike and not worry. You can go dance and explore. You can go do like X, Y, and Z. Because there are some other older dancers that'll come see me and they're like, oh my god, I've been having this back pain. I can't even like do my like rehearsals or whatever, or like I can't even pick up my kid. And I'm like, well, at this point, I'm not even worried about you dancing. I want you to be able to pick up your kid, you know? So um, I think it's like, once again, it goes back to the whole idea of like context, right? Why someone has pain. So, but yeah, so dance as a career, man, that's hard now.
Well,
But
not,
I,
I
I
mean,
think,
not even that.
yeah.
It's just, I think more like, again, and you brought it up several times in the conversation, about, growing up between, the Asian and then the American culture,
Hmm.
having navigated what you navigated, yeah, I mean, it could be simple as what would you have told your younger self what you know now, and not only for those who are dancers or, who are in this space, because, it could also resonate with others as well.
Hmm. I mean, I would probably say, what would I say to my younger? I mean, I told my younger self to keep going. Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
that's enough. That's enough.
Yeah.
Just keep
And
going.
in a more sort of like esoteric way, I guess it's like when everything else falls away. When everything else falls away, what do you have? And I think that's important too in our current world where there are like so many distractions, right? And the way that I think about this is, um, let's say in dance, if when everything else falls away, and I think that's what break-in was to me. When everything else falls away, what is left, and what is left is what I have cultivated in myself, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
what is left is what how have I developed the seeds that other people have planted in me, and which seeds do I choose to cultivate and grow?
Yeah.
Um, because I mean, it was the same thing when we were talking about like what kept me grounded. It's like, yes, entertainment can be so, we mentioned in previous conversation, there are environments that can be absolutely toxic, and you can kind of like, well, I did this TV show, and I did like this, I danced with this artist, and I did all these things, but when all else falls away, what did I have? And what I had was break-in. And break-in was like, if I go into a circle, can I handle my own? There's no glitz, no glamour, it's just my movement, music, another person. So then what does that mean? So what
Mm.
is, I guess in some ways it's like, what is the thing that you have when like everything else falls away, and what
I like
makes,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
what makes sounds so cliche to say, but what makes you you, right?
It's not cliche.
Yeah,
It's
well, it
what
wouldn't be
everyone's
cliche if it
looking.
was true. Yeah.
It's what everyone's looking for, right? I mean, and anyone who's going in that space of like
Hmm.
healing, and it's who are you? Who
Yeah.
am I? So yeah, I think that's a great way
Yeah.
to conclude here.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I will put your information in the episode resources link below,
Yeah.
and so people can
Thank
reach
you.
out
Thank
and
you.
find you, follow, etc. I've already actually also sent your link to like my cousin whose daughter is a ballerina in
Oh my
California.
gosh.
So you should
Oh,
go
in
check.
California.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I've been passing it along to
Thank
people. So,
you.
but yes, thank you so much for your time, Rob, and for sharing so
Yes,
much, so
thank you.
much.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this forum. Always, I think it's unique to be able to connect back to people at home and people from high school years, because don't get much of a chance to do it. But yes, thank you, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening to Curito Connects. For more Connects content, collaborations, and discoveries set to inspire you on your own individual journey, please head to our website at www.curito.co. Until next time, stay inspired, and thank you for joining us at Curito Connects.